Hi guys, quick one on eliminative materialism, ready for paper 2. I'm just going to run through this theory and issues, and hopefully that'll just make it kind of fall into an essay plan anyway. Weirdly, although eliminative materialism seems a little bit bonkers at first, it can actually make quite a good essay if you support it. But yeah, we'll work on that. So eliminative materialism, it was made famous by Paul and Patricia Churchill, who are neuroscientists, American neuroscientists, who feel like philosophy and neuroscience, or science in general, need to come together. The time is ready for them to come together, and that philosophy should be informed by science, which I don't think is unreasonable. It's a physicalist theory, so all facts are physical facts. And if you know all physical facts, there's nothing left to know. So that physicalist theories are limited materialism, identity theory, behaviourism. It's also, like I said, heavily informed by neuroscience. But whereas identity theory took that influence and said, well, mental states are brain states, eliminative materialism isn't like that. It is not a reductive project. It is not saying mental states are really brain states, that pain is really brain state X or C fibres, etc. Rather, it's saying at least some, if not all, let me just adjust this, if not all mental states do not exist. They can be eliminated, okay? They're just not there. So to really understand that, you have to understand what we call folk psychology. And folk psychology is our ordinary, everyday way of explaining, predicting, talking about human behaviour. And it typically involves things like beliefs, desires, hopes. So there'll be loose laws. If she is hungry, mental state, then she will find food. If she desires to pass her exam, she will turn up to class. I can predict if she suddenly decides doesn't want to go to university, she may not sit the exam. So by talking about beliefs, desires, hopes, fears, I can have a reasonably good theory about how people will behave. But this has existed for thousands of years. But it's a theory, and like any other theory, if something else comes along that would improve, then that theory would be abandoned. Now, Paul and Patricia Churchill believe that folk psychology is false, and these beliefs, hopes, desires, etc. don't exist. Now, they start off focusing on things, individual mental states, but the actual overall project is to eliminate all mental states, even if they're not particularly explicit about that. So, for example, one example that Patricia Churchill talks about is the will. The idea that we deliberate, we decide what we're going to do, and then we act upon it. And obviously, free will and determinism is a module in itself. But arguably, there is no such thing as free will. This was something we talked about that didn't actually exist. So a comparison is often made with folk physics, which was an old way of talking about physics. That turned out to be mistaken. One example is that we used to believe that there were sound particles. So if I was to tap, I'm tapping a coaster here, that makes a sound. If I'm to tap the sofa, that makes a different sound. And the folk physics explanation for that was that every object had sound particles, and when the object was hit, these sound particles were released, and that's why objects sound different. Now that's not true. Those sound particles do not exist. So when that folk physics was replaced, we didn't say, oh, here's what sound particles really are. We got rid of them. They don't exist. They do not belong in our worldview. So to give another example that I really like, we used to explain erratic behaviour in human beings with demonic possession. They were possessed by demons. And that was an explanation for it. And we would act accordingly. We would exercise those demons and try and change their behaviour. The more we learned about neuroscience and different reasons for erratic behaviour, we realised that those demons don't exist. They're not there. They're not part of our worldview anymore. We don't say, oh, here's what the demons really are. They're not there, okay? And equally, they were causing us to treat people in a very inappropriate way. So the argument from Paul and Patricia Churchill is that mental states, we're not explaining them for what they really are. It's not a reductive project. Oh, like water is H2O, pain are C fibres. No, they're not there. They don't belong in our worldview. They shouldn't be part of our theory. And folk physics, according to Paul Churchill, it just hasn't moved. It hasn't done anything for thousands of years. And it can't explain things like intelligence or dreams the way that neuroscience can. So what we should be doing is, however strange it feels, is replacing mental terminology with neurological terminology. So instead of saying, I have a fear, what I actually have is brain state X. Okay, and that will stop us falling into a lot of the errors of dualistic thinking as well. Cool. So, what's wrong with that? One of the first objections to this was, well, actually, you can't tell me I don't have mental states. It's just so self-evident. The intuitive certainty of mental states trumps everything. So Descartes' first certainty was that he was thinking, I think, and it was his first certainty for a reason. I can't deny my mental states. Now, I might be wrong about the reason I'm happy or the cause of my fear or anxiety, but the fact that I'm having it, you can't tell me I'm not having it. It's so obviously true that any theory coming along telling me I don't have hopes and beliefs and desires is clearly false. And I think that's quite a natural reaction to this theory, because it is very, very radical. Now, the reply to that, firstly, be careful about what is obvious or what is obviously true. If you take the example of going back a few hundred years, it was obvious that the sun orbited the earth. Okay, what could be more obvious? I'm watching it. I watch the sun move around the earth. And this was really useful. I could plot the paths of the tides. They had models where they would plot the stars, they would plot the tides, they would make sure ships had safe journeys based on that model. And I saw it with my own eyes. Now, we now know that that's not true, that sunrises are actually an illusion. There's no such thing as sunrises, even though we're using the terminology. There's an earth move, which is kind of a weird thing to get your head around, but that's what it is. And be careful about calling things obvious. Now, the other thing is that what eliminative materialism is not doing is denying your phenomenological experience. So you are experiencing something and nobody's denying that. That is intuitively true. They're not trying to take that away. What they're trying to deny is that is a mental state. What you're experiencing is not a belief, a hope. It's brain state X, brain state Y. In the same way that when we realised that sound particles didn't exist, we didn't suddenly deny that there was sound, but you're having when I tap this, there is an experience, but what you're experiencing is not sound particles. They were unhelpful, we need to get rid of them. Now, in the same way for eliminative materialism, I am having a phenomenological experience. Something is going on, but it's not a mental state. That's just an illusion. That's not, it's a brain state. I'm experiencing that brain state. So that is at least the first issue and reply to that. Secondly, and this one's harder to reply to actually, folk psychology, according to Paul Churchill, Patricia Churchill, is outdated, unhelpful, hasn't done anything in the last 1,000 years. Well, maybe it has. Firstly, it is really, really useful. Now, I can far more easily explain your behaviour based on your beliefs, your hopes, your desires, than any theory of neurological states. It really works. And there are certain things that neurological states find it hard to explain that mental states can. So, for example, I come home from work, I've had a really rubbish day, I decide to put on a comedy film, or I decide that today I'm going to pick a romance novel over a horror novel. How can you explain that in neurological states? If I start talking about my beliefs, my hopes, my desires, my fears, I can really make a good explanation of some of these behaviours. But neurological states are not helpful in that sense. Equally, when we think about things like mental illness and the treatment for mental illness, theories based on things like cognitive behavioural therapy, which are hugely effective for a lot of people, are based on our hopes and our desires and our fears and changing those thought processes. So in actual fact, folk psychology is useful and progressive in a way that Paul and Patricia Churchill didn't acknowledge. Kind of a hard one to come back at. The thing that will happen with that is the folk psychologist will accuse the critic of begging the question. And they would say, look, if you really understood that all there is are brain states, you would explain me putting on a comedy film or picking a romance novel in terms of neurological state X, Y, and Z. Okay, you wouldn't have to talk about beliefs, hopes, and desires. The problem is that we firstly are so ingrained in our way of speaking that it's very difficult to get rid of. And secondly, neuroscience is still in its infancy. So although there are some mental states it's been kind of a little bit apparently easier to get rid of, for example, like I said, the will. Patricia Churchill also talks about memory and attention, that we used to think were these unified mental states. We now know that they're not. They're complex brain processes. I mean, yeah, it works for that, and we're there. But the point is that as we develop our neurological knowledge, which again is, like I said, is very, very early on and very much in its infancy at the moment, that we will find it more natural to talk about, oh, I came home and immersed in neurological state X, I put on a comedy film. It's just that we don't get it yet. But the mistake would be to beg the question and assume that that's false, okay, which seems to be what the critic is doing at that point. Finally, eliminative materialism is accused of being self-defeating. That's your final criticism on the spec, at least. So let's say that I am an eliminative materialist and I am talking to you about eliminative materialism. I'm giving a lecture on it. Well, I am actually giving a lecture on it. Let's say I'm Patricia Churchill and I'm trying to persuade you of my theory, eliminative materialism. Well, in order to do so, I must believe eliminative materialism, and I'm trying to get you to believe it too. But then, if that's the case, then beliefs exist, in which case eliminative materialism is false. So either I don't believe eliminative materialism, so what's the point? Or I do believe eliminative materialism, and by believing it, I proved it false. So you've got that self-defeating element of it. In response, you're going to get that same point from the eliminative materialist. You're begging the question, because if we really understood neurological states to the point that we should and probably will, I wouldn't say I believe eliminative materialism. I'd say I have neurological state X. So actually, to assume that I would have to believe it isn't true. That's assuming beliefs exist, and they don't. So in actual fact, I wouldn't speak like that. I just talk about having neurological state X. So I don't know if you can just feel what I was trying to explain. It almost feels like, I mean, I'm not a eliminative materialist. I don't think that there are no mental states. But as I talk through it, I feel like, hold on, they've got a good reply to that, and they've got a good reply to that. And it's, I actually think a pro-eliminative materialism essay works. Not obviously, do whatever works for you, but I just kind of feel that does flow. And just to wrap that up, should that be your plan, one of the it's not on the spec, but one of the problems that people see with eliminative materialism is it takes away what it really means to be human. So how can I understand myself as some neurological process that doesn't have hopes, that doesn't have fears, that doesn't have desires, and dreams, and it takes away what it means to be human? Well, I mean, that the Churchills would argue, well, actually, we just need to better understand what humanity is. And in actual fact, if we really do understand neurological states, we will treat people better. It's a controversial example, but Patricia Churchill talks about when she had a patient who was having inappropriate thoughts. He was having paedophilic thoughts. And when he was examined, it showed that he had a brain tumour. So when they operated on the brain tumour and they took it away, these thoughts disappeared. And when these thoughts started to return, he never acted on them, but he had them and he reported that he was having them. When they looked at him, his brain tumour was coming back. So what was going on, according to Patricia Churchill, was brain states, in a sense that he should be treated very differently because we actually understood that what was going on was purely neurological. Now, that's a very controversial example, but if you think about the fact that when we eliminated demons from our explanation and treatment of erratic behaviour, how much better were we treating human beings? It was kind of horrific the way we were treating people because we believed in demons. Now, again, I'm not trying to say it's as extreme as that, but you can see that the Churchills could argue, well, hold on, if we get rid of these beliefs, hopes, desires, the will, maybe we'll treat people better. Maybe we'll have a better understanding of them. I don't know. But yeah, hopefully it's just a quick one. But I know eliminative materialism was one that was troubling a few people. So hopefully that's helped just a little bit. It's always good to hear your feedback, so thank you for that. If you're in the midst of exams at the moment, I'm literally recording this in between paper 1, paper 2, 2022. Good luck to you. I hope everything's going okay. And I will hopefully speak to you soon.